And welcome back to this, the last session of our second day. I'm Eugene Downs, ISPA board member and director of the Kilkenny Festival in Ireland. You're most welcome back to what's intended as a continuation as we actually evolve the conversation we've been opening up this afternoon on curation, on not just the good times, not just the, those amazing moments, which is maybe why we're in this business to start with. But I'd like us in this next hour or so to focus in on not so much the black and the white of programming and curating, but that interesting gray area in the middle, that almost creative gray zone where the tough decisions arise. When we think about those times when you've had to make some really hard calls, when the answer is not obvious, when there's a dilemma. And as artists or as producers or as programmers, we reach those moments where we've been developing relationships with the artists, with the ensembles that we're working with. We have been developing relationships with our audience or audiences, probably many of them. And with community or communities. And of course, that means radically different things. But for those places where we work, the broader society, the world outside, are we doing, just to take up Basma's challenge from her provocation yesterday, again, are we in some fine institution or are we somehow out on those parapets of real life and conflict and the really messy business of the world around us? So it's those interesting gray areas of dilemmas of how you can build trust, because I think let's take a look at trust, the intangible, the indefinable dynamic that maybe helps us to build those relationships, whether it's with artists, with audience, with community, but also the frailty of that, the challenges in sustaining and growing trust or rebuilding trust when things don't go right. And also I'd like us perhaps to think about this next hour, not just some really interesting examples and some sharing of experience of when things do find a way forward, maybe the surprising, the unexpected chink of light that opens up. But also, let's share, and I'd love you to, particularly for the opening part of our conversation with our guests, if you could just think about perhaps moments that you could share some thinking, some experiences of hard-won learning through maybe mixed outcome. It could be some fantastic example you have to share about where something, where there was a breakthrough in this area, or maybe a failure, but something that actually really shared something, created a learning that was really valuable and that you would like to share with us. Because I'm not going to quote Susan Sontag, but just to raise the tone, I'm going to quote Star Wars. How many here, to ask a very serious question, how many people here have seen the Last Jedi, the new Star Wars movie? Don't lie, be honest. Okay, that's actually not bad. We're not doing too bad. Oh, someone on the panel.
Yeah.
Vijay, yeah.
For sure.
So that's great. Well, we're actually, okay, it's a good start. But for those of you who have not raised your hand, Yoda the Jedi Master makes an appearance. This is I should have said this is a spoiler, I'm sorry. He appears as a Force ghost. For those of you who don't know what that is, we don't have enough time to explain.
I love it. He's such a...
But he says he chastises Luke Skywalker, his former apprentice. And he says, you're trying to pass on to your new apprentice you're learning about strength, about wisdom, about patience. And yes, those things are important. But Yoda says, what about failure? And in his wonderful Yoda syntax, he says, the greatest teacher failure is. So in that spirit, let's share the light and the shade over this next hour or so. We have a fantastic set of guests lined up to energize you as you head into the fresh New York evening. On your right, my left, a legend in our profession,
Please.
A legend in his own lifetime.
Dinosaur.
We didn't quite hear that. He arrived at the Brooklyn Academy of Music some 35 years ago BAM, to those who know it best. And of course, it has so far transcended music to be an extraordinary engine of creativity in the performing arts, and indeed in film and other areas. But to join an extraordinary team there at that time, for the last 20 years, he has been executive producer, which really means artistic director of BAM. But in that first season, 35 years ago, he created a festival in the autumn called Next Wave. And 35 years later, he is overseeing his last Next Wave festival because he is stepping down at the end of this year. So it's a really unique opportunity to welcome, to share some of his experiences, ladies and gentlemen, Joe Melillo.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next along, one of the leading musicians and composers and creative thinkers of his generation in this continent. He actually studied physics and came from a science background, although having, of course, been a musician all his life, and actually brought together science and music and cognition in some of his studies, but since then has been lighting up stages across this continent and across the world. He is a professor, Rosenblatt professor at Harvard, was guest director of the Ojai Festival in California this past year, and has played and formed mini ensembles, but with one of his leading ensembles, his sextet, their latest album has had the most extraordinary responses, and luckily for those of you in the house, he and his sextet are actually playing a lot of material from the album, but other things, as he says, no two performances are alike. Twice a night, 8 p.m. and 11 p.m. tonight, and also tomorrow, Friday and Saturday in Birdland, beautiful venue just around the corner, West 44th Street. So there's an opportunity to see him in action. Ladies and gentlemen, Vijay Iyer. Our next guest came from an artistic programming background in Amsterdam's leading theatre, but for nearly the whole last decade, she has been managing director of one of the world's greatest festivals, the Holland Festival, an extraordinary month of artistic explosion in that great city of Amsterdam. But actually, we're here to also celebrate with her because literally in the last week or so, she has been promoted to take on the top role as general director of the Holland Festival. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Annette Lekkerkerker. We should have brought the champagne, but they won't let us bring it out on stage. Health and safety. And our last guest, ladies and gentlemen, is from the Ojibwe and Oneida nations. He is an interdisciplinary artist and writer and animator, co-founder of Indigenous Direction. He's worked with institutions ranging from the Guthrie in Minneapolis through La Mama, Civilians. He has won a Grammy Award and is also in the field of musical theatre, winner also of the Jonathan Larson Award for this year. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Ty Defoe. Now, could I ask you to bring the house lights up to about 80%, please? Because even at this moment, this is a conversation in the room where there's no presentations, and at about halfway through, in about half an hour's time, we want to go out and draw in your comments, your experiences, and share some hard thinking about this topic. But just to start off, Annette, I might start with you. So you've been nearly a decade now at the Holland Festival, but in a world city with extraordinary arts all year round. So in terms of how you feel you relate to artists on the one hand and audiences and the broader community on the other, what's the biggest challenge at the moment? What kind of keeps you up at night?
To find the best art for Amsterdam for every festival period. That's what we're there for. As you said, there's a lot going on in Amsterdam year-round, very high quality. We've got beautiful venues with beautiful orchestra, beautiful theatre company, Toneelgroep Amsterdam, who has also just been again at the Next Wave Festival. So the festival has to add to that every year. There's a lot, this is a small...
We've got some visuals here,
yeah. Yeah, you don't hear the music, but it's, we do all disciplines, music, theatre, opera, you see them all. And for us, we want to attract really what what adds to what's going on year round. We think of ourselves as artist-led. So we think what the artists want to make, what they want to show, that's what we're looking for. So we don't work through themes or geographical ideas, but that's, to find the best art for the best moment.
And that's a decision. I mean, that's a strong statement to start with, because as we know, a lot of festivals and programming seasons do very much have geographic themes or leading ideas. So actually to say you start with individual artist intentions and projects is...
And then sometimes there is a kind, we call them both themes or focuses, we call them, but it's always because it's out there in the work of the artist. So we kind of say, hey, but if he's doing that and we know they are doing that, that's a good combination. So then there's this kind of line throughout festivals, and there are multiple lines in the festival. And of course we know, and sometimes we emphasize a line, and sometimes even when we're in the festival, we think, those are connected. We didn't know before. So, but it's always by looking around and listening and seeing and talking that we define what the festival is about. But it's a big festival. It's about 40, last year even 50 different productions, more than 100 shows in those 3.5 weeks.
And how do you work at maintaining the trust that you have with the audience? Presumably a lot are from Amsterdam, but then you have a lot of people traveling as well. Yeah. Like in terms of their expectation, where do you feel you need to push and pull to try and draw them into a different place than the kind of expectation they might have starting out?
That's always the big challenge. We've got quite a loyal audience, but we're always looking for the best audience for that performance or concert we have. So we always want to broaden our audience again and then keep that audience, of course. But there is what we call the core audience, and they expect a lot from us. They expect, of course, high quality. They get really angry when they think we are below what they expect from us, which luckily doesn't happen. Not ever, but not too often. But we really, I think it's, we're all kind of missionaries. So we try to say to people, come with us on this adventure. Mm-hmm. And that's also what the audience expects of us, part of the audience, not the people who come in first, but the core audience wants to be surprised. And I told you about this anecdote when I wasn't working that long with the festival, and we had just set up a new, patrons circle giving us a lot of money. And then one night when I came out of a show and this guy came up to me and he said, "Gosh, Annette, what have you done? You shouldn't have, never." And I was like, "Oh gosh, there goes the money." And but then,
So this was like a major sponsor?
Yes, a private patron, but yes, it was quite a lot of money. He just said that he would give to us for 5 years. I think, okay, let him talk. But also I said, no, I don't agree. I don't think you're very harsh on the performance. And so we had this nice conversation. But of course I was a little uneasy, and he felt that. But he said, "Oh, but never mind, that you're supposed to do that. The Holland Festival is supposed to get me irritated." And then he said something which I reminded very, very much. So he said, I'm seeing 5 to 8 shows every Holland Festival, and at least one of them should be something I don't like. And then he said, and you know what? It's always those shows I remember years after. And that's a bit of a mantra. So we are what we really want is to surprise people, of course, with good art, and we want them to like it. But we bring international art to Amsterdam, and it's by definition something they don't know yet. They do know some artists because we let them come back with new or bigger projects sometimes. But it's always something they haven't seen before. Mm-hmm. yeah, and so we want them to go on this adventure with us, and we make it the surroundings as good as it can be to be able to be open to that kind of surprise or things you haven't seen before, things you have to think about. Do I like it? Don't I like it? It's not only about liking, of course. So, okay, but that's for that, I think.
And on that note, Vijay, so as an artist and musician, you're invited to be guest music director of the Ojai Festival, and this is what practice every year. There's a different kind of guest artist programming. So what was the, I mean, what was the particular challenges you felt in wanting to put your stamp on it programmatically, but having the kind of expectations around the audience and almost the business model they have, the kind of tickets they need to sell and so on, in terms of expectations?
Sure, thanks for bringing that up, and I'm honored to be on a panel about failure. I'm trying to put the best possible spin on it. Yeah, so I'm maybe best known as a jazz musician, a pianist, composer. What I've found is that people love to say, he's a jazz musician, but he's so much more, which is all kind of like, I find a little, maybe doubly insulting in the sense that, you know, what does that say about Coltrane? Was he just a jazz, you know? So I think like part of the issue is that we let these categories serve to divide us, you know, unnecessarily, because as an artist, what I can unequivocally say, as somebody who gets to collaborate with people in a lot of different communities, is that we're all basically dealing with the same stuff. I mean, that should go without saying that that's all part of the human story. But what I also found in the context of the Ojai Festival, for example, is that, you know, it's historically been known as a kind of hotbed of contemporary classical music, and particularly, you know, the gig that I had was the same gig that Stravinsky had once, you know, and Boulez, and Esa-Pekka Salonen was lined up to do it, and he had to move his plans around, and so hastily, and maybe in a fit of insanity, they reached out to me and said, hey, we really need to fill this slot like right now, so can you, and maybe in my own fit of insanity, I said yes. But I also, you know, what I wanted to consider is that maybe I as an artist can intervene on the very premise of category, you know, and like, well, oh, new music? Well, I have some new music. I wrote it this morning. You know, I don't care what you call it. You know, or I have, you know, collaborators who have moved across a lot of different musical communities. They work with improvisers. They work with dynamite classical performers who can read anything on a page and interpret it. You know, they work across disciplines. Some people are involved in theater and movement, and particularly what I wanted to focus on is like, who is invisible to this community, or inaudible, you could say, and why, you know, and can I use this chance? I mean, presumably if they ask me to do this, it's not for me to then pretend I'm somebody else. So why don't I just bring my people to the table, you know, to the festival in a way that makes sense to me. And that was a way of harmonizing with that situation. So it wasn't that we weren't presenting contemporary classical music, but that was set in a much broader context where, you know, so I got to premiere my first violin concerto. I didn't play it because I don't play violin. It was Jennifer Coe, the incredible virtuoso, who premiered it. And we also had George Lewis's opera about the AACM, which is an association of really experimental African-American artists from the South Side of Chicago that's been in existence since the 60s. And so he created a legit opera about the formation of this collective, which was all African American voices, singing with an ensemble at a full libretto. It was in 2 acts. It had a stage and everything. We also had improviser composers from that community performing. One of them was Muhal Richard Abrams, who just passed away a few months ago, and that ended up being one of his last performances. We had Claire Chase playing her huge spectrum of solo flute music. We had Jen Hsu doing this uncategorizable hybrid of interdisciplinary performance, drawing from traditions in East and Southeast Asia. A huge range of things. And I guess what I found was that the audiences were, once you get them in the door, they're there for it. You know, they can have, like you say, I mean, it's okay to be irritated by something. In fact, my dear collaborator, Mike Ladd, and I, we realized that what we tend to do is make art out of stuff that no one wants to talk about. So we decided to start calling it irritainment. And I give that word to you. You can use it, maybe have your own series called Irritainment. I think it's good, you know, like we need to have space for contention in these festivals and these programs. But what was also nice for me is that I could walk into what was already a certain built-in audience and then expand upon it by bringing other people in who would never otherwise have set foot in that place as audiences or as artists. So that's the kind of work that I find that I can do on the ground as an artist. I mean, I wouldn't put myself in the shoes of someone like either these folks who are legends of, you know, have a profound overview of sensibility when it comes to curation. But what I find that I can do from the ground up is kind of work from the opposite premise, which is one of sameness, you know, of similarity, of what we have in common.
Well, thank you. Well, I think irritainment, we're going to give you some royalties on that, though, I think, Vijay. Ty, can I ask you, as an artist, as the other artist on the panel, but also you have created these structures like Indigenous Direction, which is really, it sounds like a platform for effectively creating programs and finding collaborators so that you're really simultaneously, it's not a festival, it's not a venue, but it's a kind of a curated set of initiatives almost, some of which you're making yourself and some of which you're working with other artists and other makers on. But do you find, I mean, as a First Nations artist, where is that challenge between what kind of expectations people bring to that? Whether, you know, if you're dealing with the Guthrie in Minneapolis or the civilians or La Mama, that on the one hand, you know, you're proactively identifying yourself as that, and there's a certain set of artistic ambitions and responsibilities you feel you have that you want to surface and bring to them, but also that could run the risk of being boxed in as well. So how do you deal with that dilemma?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it is talking about not being boxed in by these structures. So there's a great movement, I think, about decolonizing work. These colonial structures, I think, exist especially in the United States because there's a lack of recognition for that. Here on Turtle Island, it begins with protocol, recognizing whose land you're on, whose stories are you telling, and really asking those irritating questions of each other, both as programmers, but also as artists. Probing questions too, I think, by anyone that you work with in the entire process. And I feel like this is something that myself and Larissa Fastforce tended to do with some of our work with Water is Sacred Element. We look for
your co-founder in Indigenous Direction?
She's a co-founder, and we find collaborators to work with on these ventures. Kate Freer, I think, who's here, did beautiful work with video projection. So what are the ways at which we're asking people to be included in this decolonized model? Because as we know here in Turtle Island or North America, there's a lot of tokenizing that happens. I think race is a really big thing right now, topics of arts, equity, and education and access, who is dictating these kinds of colonized structures with funding and money. So that, you know, the gamut is large. So a lot of our work, I think, too, as artists, is to be the agile and to be nimble, to be a bridge between people that don't like to do work in the community or they're busy doing different things. So we operate on the circular model and taking something that we're usually boxing in ourselves and looking at models of a circle. Like, who's not included in that circle? Who's not included in those conversations, in those funding conversations, as well as the art that's being made on the stage from little grandma out in the community. She should also have something to say. Her point of view and values and social and moral interaction is just as important as the person, right, in this hierarchy, just as important. So that's some of the work we do.
And Ty, if you're reaching out, if you're reaching out in that kind of work, not just to fellow practitioners on Turtle Island, as you call it, in this continent, but also to other First Nations and First Peoples artists and makers in other continents. Is there a very lively network there, or are there interesting models and ideas being shared?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because I've been thinking about so much being here in New York City, right? Land of the Lenape people. We walk around New York City, and these buildings were made by people of the Mohawk Nation, the steel and iron workers. So I think what's interesting is that Indigenous people, First Nations people, were many nations within nations, and sometimes that's not often talked about because of also education models. People don't have access to that. So coming to this platform and format of different artists from around the world, what's so exciting is to talk about ways that we are continually decolonizing systems and models that are in place, and we're constantly questioning ourselves as art makers, as even working in the community. These systems and structures, who's making those systems and structures, and what are new ones that we just haven't even touched yet? Adrienne Marie Brown, this amazing social justice archivist, right, writes about we're trying to invent a world that which doesn't exist yet, right? Meaning that we have to sort of figure out what the futurism is of art making, pairing everything together. Also, this is commonly referred to as like indigeneity. What's the future of Indigenous people, both as artists and dealing with all the things that incorporates?
It's striking to look at, for example, north of the border, that the Canada Council for the Arts, I mean, those of us who were in Montreal maybe at the last ISPA Congress might have heard Simon Brault, who runs the Canada Council, giving a very stark speech, actually saying what a radical change is needed policy-wise, and actually in the process of making those big policy changes in the Canada Council and their programs and their supports for First Peoples and Indigenous arts in Canada, because of the degree of betrayal and of cultural dispossession, and indeed of the orphanages and so on. So there's a political, social background there, but they're actually taking major steps in terms of arts policy and arts investment and support. And in Australia and New Zealand, obviously so many colleagues here who would be working with the Australia Council or Creative New Zealand in terms of major priorities in what, over the last decade or so.
And there's lots of documents that are being shared with our Australian brothers and sisters, as well as like other nations, about cultural policy, which is huge, especially in the United States. The United States is the only country that doesn't have cultural ambassadors. So what does that tell us about our nation and how we're making work?
Thank you. Joe, when you arrived at BAM, it was this extraordinary 19th century palace culture in Brooklyn. But 35 years ago, that part of Brooklyn was, I mean, huge social, economic deprivation. It was almost like a wasteland surrounding BAM. And now when you go there, Theatre for a New Audience, Mark Morris Dance Company, all of this incredible broader cultural halo that has arisen, St. Anne's Warehouse, incredible around Dumbo and Flatbush and so on. So the impact, you can see the social, the economic, I guess the political impact that BAM has had in these decades. But do you want to share with us some kind of what are the things that some surprises that kind of stay with you over 35 years? That it's like you built and building on Harvey and you know the extraordinary team that you joined, but the relationships with iconic artists like Merce Cunningham, Pina Bausch, Mark Morris himself, Peter Brook, and so on. And over decades, you've maintained those relationships with those artists and presented a whole stream of work. Could you share with us kind of maybe some of the more difficult moments, and you know where again you keep faith with an artist when in fact you see a work, you fly to Paris, you see the new work or something, and or to Wuppertal or whatever, I'm not mentioning names, and you know they're not always, of course, the same, you know, and like any artist, things go up and down, but how you kind of keep faith, or how you also get the audience to keep faith with a body of work over time and with the kind of ebbs and flows.
We're going to talk about working together. Actually, I'm not going to reference those icons in my discussion. I'm going to talk about working with Vijay, who I commissioned to do a piano solo. And so there was not only the piano solo for the evening, et cetera, but unfortunately, there was a tragic social situation with the death of an African-American male, and Vijay was influenced by this tragic event and changed the discourse of his art as we were going into the birthing cycle. So the challenge, what I'm trying to answer your question, is supporting him in what he wants to do while simultaneously you have an institution moving along like an ocean liner, you know, and trying to keep them calm, trusting that they have, this is where leadership comes into, and you have to lean on your relationships with your staff people to understand what his intentionality is in order to deliver what he immediately had decided to do to change his art. And that was, he was not only changing his art, his own work, but he was inviting at least 20 other people to be on the stage with him for a particular reason. And that had to do with a real serious artistic aesthetic moment that was horrifying and aesthetically beautiful at the same time. And to be able to do it eloquently at BAM, where we are not improvisational, you know? And so because in order to make something like the Next Wave Festival happen, this autumn was 31 works of art, you know, and in 3 different venues, and but so you know.
Well, that's your fault because you opened.
It is, I know. But be careful for what you wish. That's the lesson, but it is everything that Annette addressed. You know that we are missionaries. We're ambassadors. You're seeking out the gems of art making on the planet. It's not, and really what is important, because I was thinking about this invitation that Eugene gave me to come here, and it said, you need to know that New York City is different. I've always shied away from being in this kind, because we are different here.
How do you mean?
I'm going to get to that. Because we're not one community. I don't use the word community. We are communities. I have, in Brooklyn, multiple communities. It gets even more, you parse it, and it gets even more complex. And you are working within the realm of limited resources. I want to be clear. BAM doesn't have a blank check for me to be a curator. You know, that we counted pennies and nickels and dimes. That's how you program at BAM. And that's really important that you understand it, because you think, oh, you know, they have it either. It's not at all. And the issue of trust comes solely from the artists you program on the stage. That they come, you know, that they buy a ticket to gain entry into an auditorium. That's the demonstration of trust for me, is that each year, when we announce the Next Wave Festival in June, people buy tickets. You know, like, I'm terrified, you know, that you're going to give a party that no one wants to come to, you know, and you don't have the luxury of relaxing in Brooklyn. You don't. The perceived citadel of culture in New York City is the island of Manhattan, and not Brooklyn.
What?
Brooklyn is going through a renaissance, given anyone who's an artist in their early 20s, they come to Brooklyn to live. They can't afford to live, you know, in Manhattan.
I thought they're being priced out of Brooklyn.
Yes.
Well, that's true too. That's a different kind of phenomena, you know, because as Eugene said, I mean, there's a kind of gentrification going on. I'm not an urban specialist, but I've seen it, I've lived it. I've been at BAM since 1983. That's when I said I'm dinosaur, because it's I worked at BAM where you use a telephone and a typewriter, you know, to do your work. So.
But you're not a meat-eating one, so.
But truly, in terms of curating, the internet has radically changed all of our professional lives. I mean, and you know, it's just research. You know, and research means just looking at links, reading blogs, reviews, materials, and then listening to music. I listen to music on my computer, and getting on a plane. I go to Geneva tomorrow. I mean, and I come back on Saturday. I mean, it's a killer, you know, when you do this kind of work, punishing on your body. I mean, that's all I'm talking about.
Well, it's interesting, as those who, and true for many people in this room, but I mean, when you get in a plane, fly long haul, and do an immediate turnaround. So you're going to really see one show and then come back 8,000 miles. And in fairness, I should say to Joe, after a lifetime in the business, one of the most, and it's interesting in terms of trust, but trust with collaborators. And I would say, and I would not put myself in this category, by the way, that after a lifetime in the business, to be still so efficient and so reliable as an email correspondent, that builds trust. That really builds trust with your artist colleagues and with your your co-presenters and so on.
But that's the other part of it is I'm going to stop talking. Is relationships. You know, in this room, I'm looking at people who I have really serious professional and personal relationships. It's fused. You know, they're not siloed. They've crossed the line. You know, I know their husbands, their wives, their lovers, their children. You know, I mean, it's like, and they know my lovers. like, you know, it is. But that's important because it really is something that contributes to our working together. That's my job. You know, is to have these relationships.
And that's part of the trust.
Absolutely.
Well, now we are going to come back to our panel, but because we are just about halfway through, I'm going to ask our wonderful technical colleagues at the back to bring the house lights up to 100, please. And we have 2 mics, both sides. I'll just ask you to come down to the mics. We'll kind of take alternating, see how we go. So with that, and I'll ask you just to introduce yourself, who you are, where you're from, and thank you. You're on.
Hi, I'm Hina Patel. I'm from Canada. I live between the US and India. I am a global fellow. Thank you for making it possible for me to be here. I want to bring up a question that we actually discussed a lot on seminar day this week, which is who defines quality? And I want to bring that up in the context of the work, how that's come into the work that I do, that 2 years ago, I started my company, Mela Arts Connect, and went out to be a South Asian performing arts specialist. And one of the impetus for creating this was because I would walk into industry conferences and there was first very few South Asian artists there, but some of them that were there that were lauded as exemplary were actually quite terrible. And they were brought there at some point when I looked at sort of world artists and how they got there, it took a white person to say that this artist is good, let's bring them to this performing arts world, right? I look around these rooms, a lot of times I don't see a lot of people with my background, my heritage in these rooms. So one, who defines quality? And two, in the process of curation, how do we acknowledge the limitations that are imposed by the gatekeepers of the performing arts world? And what are we doing to break out of that to truly make the work that we're doing reflective of the communities that we're in?
That's great.
Thank you. Thank you. Really strong question. So I might ask, yes, I think Vijay and Annette and Ty, I feel, probably have a lot to contribute on this.
I'm really glad that you put that out there, and I can relate. I really know what you're talking about, and I thought that would maybe be a good segue into me responding to what Joe said about me, because it's actually, it was kind of dealing with those questions, and with what he said is that it's not that there's one community, there are communities, and so a place like BAM maybe serves certain communities more than others, right? And I remember, that wasn't my first rodeo at BAM, right? So, and even the first time around, Mike Ladd, who I mentioned earlier, he and I had created this project that, like a lot of our work, is pretty hard to characterize, and you can't just put irritainment as a genre. And we had said, well, look, no, we're making an oratorio. And I remember that a few weeks or maybe a month before showtime, this is back in 2006, someone from your office called and said, hey, how would you guys feel if we took the word oratorio off of our advertising of your show? I'm like, why? Can I make an oratorio? So the question, maybe the answer to your question of who decides about quality is it's a kind of network of different factors. One of them is audiences or ticket sales, and that is often maybe the lowest common denominator, because people are making these gut reactions like, wait, oratorio and some guy with a name I can't pronounce that's not Puccini? Nah. Like, what else is happening that week? Or something like that, you know? So, and who's making those kinds of decisions, you know? But then the other thing was, and that the piece that he was talking about, which was in 2014, so that was on a program of 3 different pieces. One was, well, the other 2 were much more polished, you know, I would say, at least as far as I'm concerned. I did my best to polish them. And they were, you know, one was a pretty extravagant production. We played live with a film that was a beautiful film by the late, great Prashant Bhargava called Radhe Radhe. Another was a project I did with a string quartet. It was composed and very organized. And I guess, you know, it was at a time that was, it was in the time of Eric Garner, and, you know, emotions were running high. There were literally die-ins outside the door in Brooklyn, like around the corner, happening. And I just felt like, okay, Joe was generous enough to give me money. I want to give this money away. You know, it's not about me playing the piano. It's about me serving a community that's not being served. So that's kind of how I felt in that moment, and that's why I chose to do what I did, which was to bring a brilliant choreographer named Paloma McGregor, who has a group called Dancing While Black. And she and I choraled together, a bunch of our friends, all people of African descent, and we did Die In on stage. And we called it Dying In and Standing Up at BAM. And it was not on the program. It said untitled solo piano piece. So my idea was like, this is a kind of ambush, but not in a bad faith kind of way. Because Joe and I, you know, like we trust each other, but I also knew that this would be like, okay, this is, a lot of stuff has happened at BAM. I mean, Laurie Anderson, Meredith Monk, you know, some pretty wild stuff. But this was also clearly not expected. And that was kind of, to me, what I felt was, like, the element of surprise was important. To be able to say, like, okay, you came here, you bought a ticket to not see this. And that's why I'm showing it to you. You came in, this is in Fort Greene, and like I said, outside the door this is happening, but you came in here to, in a way, protect yourself from it. So I'm here to tell you that you're not, you know, we can't allow those boundaries to continue. We have to accept the reality that's right outside the door.
This is like going back to Basma's challenge yesterday, actually, or Susan Sontag's Uncomfortable Space, maybe. Mm-hmm. And actually, I might go to Annette, and thank you, Vijay, but to take that really important question, I mean, from your perspective, this question, who are the gatekeepers of quality and of the, you know, what's your perspective?
Yeah, you have to be critical on yourself and always doubt your own opinions. Do research, and it's not only your own research. Joe says you research a lot. But then you make up your mind in a way, and then you have to test your opinion. So it's about then a network, and it's always about people who point out things to you. You know, this kind of gatherings also people say, hey, did you see that one, or have you heard about that, or listen to this. And also something that Joe said earlier, it's, you know, we're here on stage, or Joe and I, but there's a team always behind us. And I think it's also in a kind of relationship with your team, because everybody in your, at least I try to, in my organization, our organization is very good at their job, but I always encourage them to, you know, say something about the other person's job. And especially like marketing, because of course our marketing manager also wants, you know, to say of 40 productions, they're marvelous, they're great, can't be missed. But that you can't do that 40 times. So and it doesn't work.
It doesn't stop us trying.
And no, but yeah. And also we always, when we it's a 100-word text for the festival book, but it's the artist who says yes, you can print it. They have the last word. So that's also very important, I think, that you and that the guy called and like the oratorium, and that you say no, I'm making an oratorium. So it's very important, but be critical and be aware that it's kind of cliche, but it's just an opinion. So you have to be very aware of that, and also see your own gaps in network and also again. Make mistakes and be open to other people pointing them out to you. I think that's very, very important.
Thank you, Annette. And maybe, yes, Ty, I mean, on that other part of your question on kind of decolonizing perceptions of quality and so on.
Well, it's such a great question, because I feel like, from my point of view, the answer is simple. It's like, who says that something is good? Well, it's people with the most power. It's the people with the most privilege. And who are those people? You know, fill in the blank, right? So I think that's just like my answer for that. And then I think the other thing, what to do about that, is to do things such as colleagues here on stage have said, is about creating a feedback loop. Healthy feedback loops are really important. Naming who's doing the work when it's getting done. And that goes right back to leadership. Things like your fellowship, I'm sure, are helping out. We're in a room full of, you know, artistic leaders here taking this information. So hopefully you all are going back and creating teams. But raising those kinds of questions in rooms like this, I think, are really important. So I just wanted to speak to your question directly about decision-making and power.
Thanks, Di, and thank you for that terrific question. Great opener. Now, please.
Hi, my name is Brenda Walker. I'm with the acoustics firm Kierkegaard Associates, and I'm also, that's how I answer that when people ask me what I do. I don't say but. I say, and I'm also a producer, writer, and musician. And when I've tried to do events, to produce events, even the mention of the word reconciliation causes progressive people to recoil, and they find it intolerable. So I'm wondering, how do you engage hostile members of your community, but they're still members of your community, who are threatened because they think they're going to lose their privilege, because in their mind, we live in a zero-sum world. And specifically for Thai, do you think it's possible to decolonize without the colonizer?
Thank you for that.
Two great questions. The first one, I think, different rules of engagement that is commonly, I think, about bringing people together is to have group agreements, group guidelines, right? These are things, I think, that can be part of protocols and put in place when you're working with groups of people, from youth to elders to people in between, from board members, trustees, always going back to the guidelines, because the community, the people, the group, the team, right, should be the ones defining those rules, because that's the system that you're operating in. And so when things go awry or dismay or something like that, I always go back to the group agreements, the group guidelines, right? It's probably a slow, arduous process, yes, about building something, but have scaffolding and having those layers about coming to a consensus, right? Which can be really fearful and scary, because not one person knows everything, but together we know a lot. So group agreements. The second thing is I think that's just a great question, and I hope through the artistic practice that I do, we'll answer that question about reconciliation and working together with both the colonizers, also people that have chosen to opt out of that, who are working towards allyship and accomplishment, and also artistry. So there's this dance I got when I was about 7 years old, and it's called a hoop dance. It's a Native American traditional dance, and it's done with one hoop. And every year I've added 1 or 2 hoops on, right, every single year, to make different shapes and formations in life, in nature. And through this dance, it's a way that I found myself as an artist trying to answer these questions about, is it possible to create art, create a world with both colonizers and like the non-colonizers, and what are ways at which we are opting into being a colonizer ourselves, right? Whether we're a person of color, whether we're a white identified person, a male identified person, a cisgendered identified person. I think the question that you posed was so intelligently put together to like continue to ask ourselves that. So I don't have an answer, but come see some of my art, because these are some of the themes that I explore the question.
Thanks, Diane. And Brenda, I just add, from an Irish perspective, as you say, can you decolonize without the colonizer? It does raise the interesting question of language, and that one path, although of course not sufficient, but one potentially very powerful path, is for the colonized to subvert and take ownership of the language of the colonizer. And certainly in Ireland, actually taking the English language and making something other of it, but actually that then reinfected almost the colonial country, was certainly one very unstable energy that helped kind of open up some of those things here. But back to and thank you again for that comment. Sorry, Vijay.
I just also want to thank you for making those statements in a question. And as I ask myself those kinds of questions every day, as I gave a talk a few years ago, and the title of the talk was "Complicity with Excess," because I found myself. The phrase comes from the artist Yinka Shonibari, who he would like photograph himself in European fineries, or like put himself into the scene of like a Dutch master's painting or something like that. And he wanted to interrogate his own kind of like relationship to power and to empire and to these corridors of privilege, and I find myself, when I have these kinds of opportunities, like as a curator of a hallowed institutional festival, or being on faculty at Harvard, or you know, just being able to move in the world with the privilege I have as a, you know, quote unquote successful artist. To what extent am I becoming part of the problem? I ask myself that all the time. But I also find that this is a really peculiar moment. And in a way, I find things are, well, there's no mystery why. But like questions I wouldn't have asked myself 2 years ago, I find coming up now. And being an American especially. And you know, when I try to bring up issues like we're talking about in my classes, I find that the students now, they'll often kind of revolt. And I got a couple of course evaluations just the other day, and one of them said, do you want to spend 5 hours a week being attacked for being a white man playing music? Then this course is for you. I was like, hold up, man. Now wait a second. But what I found amazing is the bad faith with which this guy was speaking, because he was referring to literally 5 minutes from the whole semester where something happened in the course of conversation that was then redressed and healed and everything, and yet still he wanted to torpedo the entire enterprise. And so that to me is like what we're up against now is like trolling, basically. And to me, what we as people in the arts community can do is continue to elevate the discourse and insist on a more sophisticated and nuanced understanding of how we interact and what it is that we can do together. And that's like I say, it's a battle and a question I'm facing every day.
Thanks, Vijay, and thank you again, Brenda. Now, we've less than 10 minutes left, but we have 3 colleagues at least with comments. So Chris Lorway from Stanford.
Hi. I just wanted to sort of bring up the concept of what I'll term pot buy-in, the poker term, which is when you feel you're so far into it, you can't pull out, and you may as well keep throwing investment into it. And I'm wondering, as sort of both from the perspective of both the curator and the artist, when you find yourself going through cycles, especially with artists who you've developed those trust relationships with, where you find that it's become a money pit or you know that it's not there, how do you best negotiate yourself out of those types of situations?
Great. Well, I think what we'll do is actually let's take a few comments and questions together and we'll hold them and then come back. So that's Chris on the kind of all-in strategy with artists.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Tafadzo Mzondo. I'm a first-time global fellow here, and I'm from Zimbabwe. I just want to thank Vijay for giving me a word that I will use in my fight with my programs manager back home, irritainment. Because we run an outdoor venue, and it's pretty much in the neighborhood, what you would call the ghetto. And half the time our programming has been, we have upcoming artists who come to perform, poets, musicians, and stuff like that. And then we also try to get one serious or established artist to be like a guest artist. And I've noticed in most of these instances, there's a genre of music in Zimbabwe called dancehall, and they've called it Zim dancehall. And so most of the times when we have this serious artist who's playing proper music, which I really want to curate, you have people going away. And then when these youngsters start playing Zim dancehall, everyone like is happy. And then so I have a fight with my programs manager, and then he says, so why are we paying these established artists if these youngsters can actually pull a crowd? And so I'm going to tell him it's called irritainment. but I've just have one quick question though, in terms of the justification, because he's obviously going to ask me to expand. And then what's the justification for the irritainment? When do you start getting the dividends? I mean, don't you risk losing a community that you are serving because you are insisting on what you think is quality, and you want to call it irritainment, and indeed that community gets irritated, like when you try to play serious music with instruments. You get these youngsters, they don't even play any instrument, they just have backtracks, and their music is noisy, but it gets everyone like frenzy and jumping. So I mean, when do you start realizing the dividends of irritainment and And I mean, how do I justify to my programs manager that irritainment is the way to go? Thank you.
Thank you. It's definitely catching on, Vijay. Thank you for that. So hold that comment and we'll come back to it. And now we have OCL from Stockholm. Briefly, we're literally almost down to the last 5 minutes. So if I could ask again, just to kind of draw the thought together as much as possible.
My name is Oskar Livanges. I serve as head of communication at Lekkerkerker. It's a contemporary circus company and institution based in Sweden. This is my first year here as a non-fellow. I've been a fellow for 3 years, so very excited to be here in this new role. I would like to add more a comment. It's not a question, but since we're talking strategies and practice within diversity issues, then I would like to add my own experience. Before working within a circus, I've been working with music promotion, especially towards urban youth music expressions and also global music for very narrow expressions for small communities in Sweden and Scandinavia. And talking about diversity issues, a matter that has been discussed now maybe for 40 years, at least in Sweden, and it still seems so difficult many times. It's easy to get stuck on the barriers, on the problems. We don't have the right cultural policies in place. These are different groups to address. It might be socially or economically harder groups to work with. We saw earlier an example of a festival that did a fantastic work, but that had a free entrance and so on. So many think that, oh, I can't offer that. That's the reality of most programmers, that it's not easy to go that generously. But still, I would like to address more on the opportunities that I see. And two main reasons for this. One, there is an demand. There is a demand for issues that have an impact, that have something to say. I think that the musical Hamilton here is a huge success, an example of that. The record-breaking, very political, diverse cast and all of that. So that's inspiring, coming from the most commercial sectors of all. And also the new technologies that we have, the way we can track, the way we can explore what people are watching, listening to, and talking about the youth, hip-hop music, for instance, that has been marginalized for a long time. In Sweden, it's mainly immigrant youth that produces it, many times by themselves. But following the stream statistics, that's the revenue income that the labels are doing today. And also as promoters and programmers, to follow these streams. I programmed last year, Luis Fonsi. It was an exceptional hit with Despacito. But we could see how that song was showing the growth, in which cities it was being most streamed. We used the artist's on Facebook to target with our ads his followers in Sweden. Very delicate methods now to really address the communities. So there is not that many excuses anymore for us to start setting up the strategies, do our research, and maybe in the end, even addressing these smaller audience groups, the risk will be not that much bigger than an ordinary program. Because the last thing, if you address them with something that they might be interested in, they might be able to pay quite a lot as well. So that's something that I also have experienced. So start managing the diversity practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Ozel. Thanks so much for that. And now a final brief comment from the floor, and then we'll just brief final words for the panel. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. I'm Amy Miller. I'm based in Birmingham, Alabama. I work at the Alice Stevens Center. I'll try to keep it very brief. I'm just going to offer an image that's been circling with me, literally circling through this conversation, and in relation to a very strong trend that we're all seeing in this field as far as our demographics changing in rural and urban spaces, and therefore the need of curation models to be changing. And I want to offer the image and the notion of the circle, right? So we all are indigenous to this planet, whether we are far removed from that notion or not. And I've been thinking through this talk about how all ancient cultures that have been excavated, they've found a spiral or a circle in all of these forms and all of these communities that have been depicted over time. Yet we are based on structures that are patriarchal, that are colonizing, that are a Eurocentric model that is very linear versus circular. Circular is also more effeminate at times. So I want my question for all of you, and the whole notion of revolution, we're in an arts revolution. Revolution is a circle. It's a spiral that many voices are all equal at the table. So as curators, my question would be, and comment in general, is how are we taking the ego out and the individual out of the curation, and how are we actually building models to build trust with communities that are more circular? I know Vijay and all of your work reflects that, but how are we actually taking our space from the table and bringing in the community in a circular way?
Amy, thanks so much for that final contribution from the floor, and actually a really nice note, I think, to just maybe go back for, again, we're almost out of time, but just a final thought from each of our panelists on maybe that question of the circle or models of revolution, Chris's challenge of when you go all in with an artist, or how is just trust, how again that those questions. We can't cover everything, but just a final thought from me. We'll start with Ty.
Yeah, so one thought I had is I wanted to know what dinosaur Joe would be. It's been racking my mind through this whole panel, as well as all the as well as the other amazing things that people have said. A thought though, just to tag on to the circle that we are talking about both individually, also institutionally. I feel like these multiple circles, it's like an image to me that I work off of a lot, I think, within institutions, but also as an interpersonal level, which is really important. Like, look at your friend circle. Like, who is in your friend group? And you should be constantly be vetting yourself, right? In language that was brought up, and the art that you go to see, and the art that you go to see and invite your friends. Who are you inviting to these types of things? So I just wanted to put that on the table in terms of an interpersonal conversation, that asking yourself, going off of Joe's comment about relationship building and trust and knowing each other, right? Knowing each other's families, spouses, significant others. This is really important. There's a word in Ojibwe language. It's Nindawe Namaganug, and it refers to as we are all related, right? Not even just two-legged people, right? Person, but it's the two-legged, four-legged, winged, and the rooted. Nindawe Namaganug, we are all related.
Thank you, Ty. Thanks so much. Annette.
Yes, a short remark to Chris. Of course, those kind of situations are painful. It's painful for all parties because you invested a lot of trust and energy and sometimes also money, which will not deliver on all fronts. So it's a painful conversation then going on. But I think honesty is very essential then. And on the circle thing, I want to add. I'm a little bit hesitant to say because I totally agree with you. It's a beautiful. We all are part of communities, but we should, especially in the arts, I think. The individual artist and his or her very individual, personal view on the world can bring all of us something. So I think we should not abhor totally from individuality in the notion that we're all individuals and we share more than what we don't share. But I think the very personal view of the artist on the world is very essential and can give us a lot to communities and make us unite. So in art and culture, there are two different things going on at the same time. They unite and they differ. But I think it's also, the art should also be able to make us disagree in a peaceful way. And disagreement should not be underestimated and to talk about. I think it's an old philosophical idea, these, antithese, synthese. So by getting something new forms, new perspectives, they can really add to a new view on the world, on yourself, on how it can be. It's like about, so yeah. So yes, we're all together in it, but we're also all separate. And the individual view of the artist is very important, I think, also.
Thanks. Vijay.
I really enjoyed everything that both of you said. I was reminded of, so I mentioned Muhal Richard Abrams, who he passed away at the age of 87 in September, and was a pioneering composer, improviser, pianist, and institution builder, African-American from the south side of Chicago. And I had the chance to interview him for the Mid-Atlantic Arts Foundation a few years ago when he was presented with one of their awards. And I asked him, thinking back to late 60s, early 70s, when members of the AACM, the group of artists from Chicago, they were basically they lived in poverty in Chicago, on the south side, almost entirely African-American community, basically de facto segregated, even though it was in the north. And they found themselves suddenly traveling and being presented on stages in Europe. And so I asked him, what did that feel like? He's like, what do you mean, what did it feel like? And I said, well, to have cultivated your work in such a, in the context of one community, and then to have it be organic to that community, and then to see it travel, basically to new vistas. Like, what did that feel like? He said, well, when we encountered those audiences, they knew nothing about the milieu that we came from, or how we had grown up, or what our origins were, but something we did, this is how he put it, he said, something we did rung a bell for them that was already there. And then he said, but wait a minute now, they also rung a bell for us. So that's the circle, right? It's a circle of resonance that reaches across difference. I think a lot of the issues that we're facing, even when we use the word community, which is on the screen, it's been like hovering over us this entire time, which we didn't really define ever. But when we talk about community, what we seem to be doing is distinguishing, right? Or it's this and not that. It's us and not them, right? I have a friend who's a social scientist who defined community as something that lives largely in the imagination. Because if you say you're part of a community, you can't see all of those people at once. So most of it is in your mind, right? So that's kind of where that's the part that is already there, the resonant part. So that's what I think we can always engage with.
Thanks, Vijay. And Joe, final word to Joe.
Well, I think that what I want to share is that if you adopt a philosophy and a professional practice of service, that it allows you to generate those relationships that I addressed, and to have authentic relationships with members of the communities within which your artistic entity or your cultural entity exists. And that for myself, metaphorically, I self-define as a creative problem solver, and which means the creation of an artistic season. It means making the judgment about an individual artist or a production. And I have had the experience of the difficult conversation, but Annette nailed it. Be honest. It's simply telling the truth of the situation, and see how reconciliation, either the project is not going to actualize, or it's going to be postponed, or it's going to be canceled. And the artist plays an essential role in that particular discussion. But that is what the facts are about our collective profession. And just in conclusion, my metaphor, octopus. The core, the center core with all those tentacles going out. That's how I see my world.
I think everyone's going to be talking about that when we leave this room. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for some really probing thinking and for some very open speaking and open dialogue. And just as we hand back over to David, lots more conversation to come tomorrow, and you're going to have a great night in the town. Please join me in thanking our panel, Joe, Vijay, Annette, and Ty.